We are joined today by Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense and CIA Director. Secretary Gates addressed a general session of NCSL's Legislative Summit. His latest book is Duty, Memoirs of a Secretary at War. He is president of the Boy Scouts of America and an Eagle Scout. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, I grew up in a town of 500 people, and when I was 10 years old and in the 5th grade, they started a scout troop. And I have many great memories of that. Learned how to pitch a tent, start a fire, things. But the one thing that has stuck with me through all these years is that a scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. And as I grow older, that seems to be a pretty good template for living a responsible life. Do you ever think about that and those Boy Scout laws and how all that may have affected you as you were growing up?
Well, the Scout Oath and Law have been with me all my life. I was a Cub Scout. I have a photograph of my father in my study in a Boy Scout uniform in front of his house in Kansas City in 1918. He wasn't an Eagle Scout, but he made sure both my brother and I were. And it really was a formative part of my life. And my earliest experiences and learning about leadership was in the Boy Scouts. As I talk about in a new book, there's nothing quite like in teaching leadership skills to trying to get a bunch of 12 and 13-year-olds to do what they don't want to do, and you can't make them do it. And you're only a year older than they are. And if you can do that, you can probably manage just about anything.
What style of leadership is it taking to sell the situation with the Boy Scouts now, with the repeal of the prohibition of gay scoutmasters? What does it take?
My approach, and I've learned a lot over the years. I made some mistakes in the early years when I first had senior positions, but one of the things that I've learned in the intelligence, leading the intelligence community in CIA, and then being president of Texas A&M, and finally Secretary of Defense, is the importance of having an inclusive decision-making process. People don't get surprised. People have an opportunity to weigh in with their opinions. They have an opportunity to be consulted, to express their views, and to make suggestions on how to do something better if you have a proposal. And I think when people feel like they've been a part of the process and they've been respected, that it's much easier for them to agree to a decision or support a decision, even if, in fact, originally they didn't.
Do you call any of the experiences you had that the country went through with Don't Ask, Don't Tell? I mean, are there things that also resonate with?
Well, I think the same principles applied. We surveyed, our folks came in, and I told the president we needed to do, before any action was made, we had to consult with the troops. We had to get the views of the troops and their families as to the impact, what they thought about this change, the impact that it would have, their concerns, and so on, so we could shape the decision to take those concerns into account. Those who ran the review suggested that we survey 200,000 soldiers. I told them to do 400,000. So in the process, and not just soldiers, but sailors, Marines, airmen, and soldiers, we did surveys of 150,000 military spouses. So, and we did thousands of focus groups and town hall meetings and things like that. Not me personally, but the team that was doing this. So I think people, for the first time probably ever, the military actually had a conversation with itself about this subject. And lo and behold, when we got those surveys back, 2/3 of the people who were surveyed said that a change wouldn't have any impact, or in fact might make the services better. So I think having this inclusive process in the military was a process that I wanted to emulate for the Boy Scouts.
During the Bush administration, you write about this in your book, you recommended not complying with Israel's request to get military support that would have let them attack Iran's nuclear sites. And President Bush went along with you. I wonder what you were thinking while the U.S. was and its allies were going through this series of negotiations with Iran on their nuclear deal, and what you think of the final deal that was reached.
Well, I think that first of all, getting the Iranians to the bargaining table in the first place was a success for policies followed under President Clinton, President Bush, and President Obama, the economic sanctions. Frankly, I believe we could have negotiated a better deal. I have real concerns about the verification provisions and their compliance. I have concerns about snapback sanctions, not to mention the extraneous, the non-agreement parts of Iranian behavior in the region and so on. So my concern is that I think we got out-negotiated in some respects. I couldn't understand, for example, why over a year ago the White House resisted Congress passing additional draconian sanctions on Iran, but sanctions that would only be triggered by failure of the negotiations. It was pressure, economic pressure, that got them to the table in the first place. And it seems to me if we had had that in the background a year ago, it would have significantly increased the administration's leverage in the negotiations. All that said, and I believe the deal is a flawed deal, but I also believe that voting it down at this point has significant negative consequences of its own. I think that we would be all alone. We would be isolated, not Iran. I think the sanctions would be impossible to sustain. Iran could junk the good parts of the agreement, such as the 97% of their enriched uranium being taken out of their hands, and the changes that are being made in some of their facilities. So I think the pieces of the agreement that are good, I think we would lose. And I think we would lose all of our leverage except military, in addition to the isolation. So I guess my view is we have to face the reality. We got out negotiated. We have a flawed agreement. But the consequences now of rejecting it, I think, are severe. And so I believe that, and I think would have a real impact on the credibility of the United States around the world. Perhaps not in some of the Arab states and in Israel, who hate this deal, but I think in a lot of other places, in terms of if we agree to something, will we stick to it? So I guess reluctantly I would say that I think that we probably ought not vote the deal down.
A hallmark of your tenure as in Washington was your empathy for and actions to protect as much as you could the soldiers who were fighting overseas. When the Walter Reed scandal broke, you fired people at the top of the clipboard, not at the bottom. Given all that and what you've done, what do you think of the way the VA is handling the care of returning veterans, and what would you like to see done?
Well, I think part of the problem with VA also affected elements of the Department of Defense early on. And that was, nobody thought these wars were going to last very long. Nobody dreamed that the casualties would be as great in numbers as they were, and that there would be so many young people with such severe wounds that would require years of rehabilitation. So I think that an organization, I mean, the last real war we fought where there were significant casualties was Vietnam. So you had a VA that had reached a point where most of the people that they were taking care of were older people. And they were problems associated with what wounds they may have received decades before, or the routine problems of aging. And now all of a sudden you're flooded with these young men and women. And I think they were totally unprepared for it. And I think they were incredibly slow in coming to deal with it. I think there are also a lot of bureaucratic problems. There are problems within the department. I believe that VA is probably the most micromanaged organization in the government by Congress, because every member of Congress is sensitive to veterans and veterans' interests. And so there's a lot of very close congressional attention to VA, and some of it's, maybe a lot of it's, not very productive in terms of how you make VA work better. And so I think there are a variety. There's not a simple explanation for the problem. I think that they've been protected from budget cuts. They've gotten a lot of additional resources. So I think that Secretary McDonald, brought in from the outside, is a good man and has a lot of good qualities. But I think he faces what a lot of business people do when they're brought in to head a government agency. They're faced with obstacles and difficulties in getting the job done that they've never encountered before.
Your dislike for Congress and how it goes about its business or doesn't go about its business was abundantly clear in the book and in your address today. Here you are speaking to legislators at the state level. Based on what you've observed over the years with Congress, what sort of advice would you give state legislative leaders for getting things done?
Well, I think the truth is, just based on what I read, I don't have a lot of familiarity with the activities of specific state legislators. But what I read suggests to me that in most states, the legislatures are actually pretty effective. It's one thing about state government and being the mayor of a city. If you're the mayor of a city, it doesn't matter what your ideology is. If you don't shovel the snow, and if you don't pick up the trash, and if you don't pave the roads, you're not going to get reelected. State government, similarly, is much closer to the voters, and I think has to be more responsive to actually getting things done. And so ideological paralysis in a state has more immediate consequences and is more intolerable to the people of that state than writ large for the nation. And so I think the states in many respects have become extraordinary laboratories for experimentation and innovation and how you deliver services, how you try and control costs and things like that. And I think also you don't have, again, in most states, you don't have the kind of furious partisanship in the state legislatures that you do in the Congress. I remember when I was president of Texas A&M, there's just nothing like the state of Texas in the Constitution. Their legislature meets for 140 days every 2 years. They either have to do a budget or there's nothing. So I think the fact that I guess I would say I think another thing that helps is that most legislators at the state level, being in the legislature is not their full-time job. Most of them have their own careers in business or teaching or whatever. And so they have a connection to the real world, the everyday world that most Americans deal with that full-time, well-paid members of Congress don't, who are surrounded by significant staff members and so on. And I think state legislators are just more connected to the real problems people are facing and probably feel more accountable.
You were asked to continue in your position by a president of the opposite political party. In light of your experience, would you advise another president to take this sort of team of rivals sort of approach?
Well, I think it's really two different questions. First of all, I think it depends on the circumstances. I think the circumstances in my case were very unusual. We were in the middle of two wars. We had, and neither of them, well, by that time, by 2009, Iraq was actually going pretty well. But we still had big problems in Afghanistan. And I think that for a president who came into office without foreign policy experience and facing the wars, it was important in terms of perhaps providing a sense of reassurance and comfort to the American people that there was going to be continuity and, frankly, reassurance to the military that there would be continuity on these big issues relating to defense in terms of the wars going forward and taking care of the military and so on. So it depends. It's a very unusual situation. There have been others. I'm the only Secretary of Defense ever invited to stay on by a newly elected president, but there have been some other cabinet members over the years who have been, although it is pretty unusual to go from one party to the other, but I think it just really depends on the specific circumstances.
Thank you, Secretary Gates.
My pleasure.
Appreciate your time.
Yep.